everyone. So you should be on your updated photosynthesis notes for this screencast. So what we're going to start with is just a general recap of the plant cell. So if we remember, we talked about plant cells. Plant cells are autotrophs. And hopefully in your mind, you're thinking about what an autotroph is. An autotroph is something that can make its own food. So you're not an autotroph because you are a heterotroph because you must eat other things. And so photosynthesis is a process to do this, right? So we talked about this. And specifically, plants are the guys that we're really looking at with this. But other organisms do photosynthesis too, like photosynthetic protists and other things. So when we look at this diagram right here is a plant cell. So when I refer to this, you'll know what I'm talking about. And the first question we have is, do plants and their cells need energy? And we've talked about this, but yes, they do. They need the specific type of cellular energy that we do. They need ATP. Or adenosine triphosphate. And so how do they process their energy? Well, they do the same sort of things as you do once they get it. So they get it in a different way. They get energy, aka food, through photosynthesis. And what they do in that process, right, is they take that solar energy, and they convert it into chemical energy like glucose. And glucose is a biomolecule. So that's stage one, right? They got to get that energy. And then they process that energy. So they take the chemical energy and they convert it to cellular energy. And they do that in cellular respiration, just like us. And so when I look at my plant cell, I see two main organs. So you can't quite see it, but I'm highlighting that chloroplast right there. I'll draw an arrow. So that chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis. And so since you don't photosynthesize, you don't have a chloroplast. And then what we see is our mitochondria, which hopefully you can see too. And that we learned is the site of cellular respiration. And so you and plants have mitochondria. You do not have a chloroplast, but plants have that. The next question says, how do you increase your biomass? Well, let's remind ourselves what biomass is. And so biomass is basically living matter. And when we talk about this, how do you increase your biomass is basically asking you, how do you grow, right? So how do you grow? Your answer would be, well, I eat food. And so because you're a heterotroph. Now, how does a plant increase its biomass? Well, it does it in a different way. It photosynthesizes. Because it is an autotroph. And so we'll see this as we go through. So photosynthesis, if we remember, photosynthesis we said is sun energy plus 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules. And this gives us one lovely C6H12O6, which I hope in your mind you're saying glucose, and 6 oxygen gas, which is technically a byproduct for the plant, but cool. So glucose is a biomolecule, and this is a lot different than carbon dioxide, which is a molecule. And so if you remember, plants do something really important, which is they take inorganic material, like carbon dioxide, and they make it organic. Which you can't do. So thank you, plants. And so they take those molecules and they convert it into biomolecules. When we talk about photosynthesis and where it occurs, we'll look at a couple different things. So when we're looking at this, we are looking at our chloroplast, Our chloroplast is one of those specialized organelles, just like the mitochondria. This is the chloroplast's membrane. So just like a cell has a membrane, a chloroplast has a membrane. Inside the chloroplast, we have two things. And so we just see like one stack of them. So first we have the stroma, which is basically the jelly filling. And so that's going to be the site of our Calvin cycle. Some people like to call the Calvin cycle the light independent reactions. I shy away from that name because when we look at this, we're going to see that the Calvin cycle is driven by the light dependent reactions or the light reactions. So I don't like to think of it as independent completely. These other things that we have are called thylakoids. They look like a pancake. They're basically another membrane sac or pancake style structure. And this is going to be the source of our light dependent or our light reactions. And we can see this because our light dependent reactions will be driven by sun energy coming in. One more quick thing, a thylakoid, if we have multiple stacks of thylakoids, so or multiple thylakoids in one stack, we call the whole thing a granum. So if I just have one pancake, it's a thylakoid. If I have a stack of pancakes, it's a granum. So you just want the basic overview here of what's happening. So the light dependent reactions, what we see is we see sun energy coming in. And what our thylakoids are going to do is through a series of reactions, they're going to convert the sunlight energy into usable cellular energy. This is going to be really important for us. So I'm going to fill this diagram in really quickly. And so we're going to see water coming into the light-dependent reactions and oxygen coming out. So where is oxygen produced? In the light-dependent reactions. In the Calvin cycle, we'll see carbon dioxide coming out or being produced, and we'll see being used, carbon dioxide being used, and we'll see glucose coming out. And so what happens in the light-dependent reactions is basically our sunlight energy comes in, and through a series of reactions, the thylakoid will convert the sunlight energy into usable cellular energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. So if you were to pause the video right now and say, okay, where is the energy? You would think to yourself, the sunlight energy has been converted into cellular energy that now the chloroplast can use to make carbon dioxide into glucose and again take inorganic matter and make it organic. So these two molecules, these will be usable cellular energy. One little thing about NADPH. So NADPH is really similar to NADH. NADPH is a high energy electron carrier. And what does that mean? We saw this just like in cellular respiration. We saw that there was some energy transferred to these electron carriers. And so NADPH is just the one that's going to do that for photosynthesis. And one thing I still remember, how I remember NADPH as being in photosynthesis is that it has a P in it, and so that's in photosynthesis. And so what's going to happen now is the light-dependent reactions, their products, aka ATP and NADPH, they will drive the Calvin cycle. And so without the products of the light-dependent reaction, the Calvin cycle wouldn't happen. And so what the Calvin cycle is going to do is it's going to come in, and it's going to use that ATP, it's going to use that NADPH, and it's something we call carbon fixation. And so it's going to fix, I'm air quoting, but you can't see it. It's going to fix the inorganic carbon and make it organic in the form of glucose. Or we can put this here, C6H12O6. And once the Calvin cycle uses the ATP and the NADPH, which again is carrying the sun energy, so I should put this. This is carrying, we're going to air quote that, sun's energy. So once the Calvin cycle uses these products to take the CO2 and convert it to glucose, it's going to actually shuttle the reactants of NADPH and ATP back to the light-dependent reactions. So it will send NADP plus and ADP in that phosphate, so the less energetic forms, back to the light-dependent reactions so that they can pick up sun's energy and do the whole thing again. And so it's this beautiful cycle for photosynthesis. So when you look at this, I want you to constantly be asking yourself, where's the energy? So where is the sun's energy? And what does that sun's energy allow the chloroplast to do? It allows it to take that inorganic carbon dioxide and convert it into organic glucose that the plant can use for structure, that it can use to increase its biomass, that it can use to make ATP by being broken down in cellular respiration. And so with that, I would recommend that you summarize these things, right? So the light reactions, our reactants, definitely be solar energy, and water. You could also maybe say that ADP and phosphate and NADP plus are reactants because they're going to pick up sun's energy and take it over to the Calvin cycle in a way that the chloroplast can use. And then similarly, the light reactions products will be oxygen, which will be released from the chloroplast, and maybe it'll be used in the mitochondria, but the plant produces a bunch of oxygen, so some of it will be given to us. So oxygen, NADPH, and ATP. Note that this is not enough ATP for the cell to survive on alone. It's just enough to make glucose. And then in the dark reactions, it's going to take the products from the light reactions. So ATP and NADPH. Right, let's switch our color. Let's point. They're going to go right there. And it's also going to take carbon dioxide, and then it's going to give us glucose. And if you want to, you can also put an ADP plus, an ADP, and phosphate to get at that cyclic nature of these two processes. And so if you were to ask yourself right now, where did a plant's mass come from? You should be able to answer that it's actually not from water, because if we look, right, back to our knowledge of elements, the majority of water's mass, that is the oxygen, is going to be released directly after the light-dependent reactions. So the source of the plant's mass is actually the carbon dioxide that you breathe. So if you think about that money tree that's in our classroom or in our lab, that money tree is growing because of the carbon dioxide that's in the air. And so that's its source of mass. The last thing I want to talk about, and we talked about this a little bit before, was where's photosynthesis happening? Well, if we remember, the chloroplast contains chlorophyll. And there's two types, which you'll kind of see in a minute, but we can just focus on chlorophyll in general. It's a pigment that absorbs light. In other words, it's a pigment that absorbs the light that photosynthesis needs. And so your chloroplasts are chock full of chlorophyll, specifically the thylakoid. And so if we remember too, we were talking about chlorophyll. Plants are green, or let's put it this way, leaves are green because you see that the green light is actually reflected to you. So the chlorophyll is absorbing every color except for green. And so when we look at this tree, we think about this, and just thinking about trees in general, right? Who's going to get the most sun exposure? Photosynthesis will be happening in our green leaves. So mostly in the leaves. And we know that because they're green, they have chlorophyll. Finally, this last chart is showing you the relationship between photosynthesis and light absorption. So absorption means it's able to be used. So able to be used. For photosynthesis. And so we just talked about chlorophyll giving, in general, a greenish color to plants, right? And that's because it's reflecting light. Reflecting green light specifically. And that's because the light that comes from the sun has all the colors. And so it's just reflecting the green. But if you thought about it, if you put a plant underneath a green bulb or a blue bulb or a red bulb, it would likely have different rates of photosynthesis because it wouldn't be able to absorb and reflect the same types of light. And so what this graph shows you, you see on your y-axis here, the percentage of the light absorbed. And I like to think to myself, right, well, light is going to drive photosynthesis. We saw this in the spinach leaves lab. And so what is increased absorption going to do to the amount of photosynthesis that can happen? So think about that for a second, and it'll help you to answer these questions over here. Similarly, we see the wavelength of light on the bottom, and it correlates to our colors. So green is about 500 to 600, 575-ish nanometers, right? Red is like 650 plus, okay? And so this helps us to understand when photosynthesis happens most efficiently. So I'm not gonna pause it, but you should pause the video and try to answer these questions based on this idea of light absorption. Where do you believe photosynthesis activity will be the greatest? And then I want you to justify it. And where do you think photosynthesis activity will be the lowest? And then you should justify it. I hope you paused it, but where do you believe photosynthesis activity will be the greatest? Well, I'm going to look at my graph. Where is my absorption the highest? And so this is talking about two different pigments, chlorophyll B and A, but they are just about the same. So I would look and I would say probably right about here. So I would give a range, basically anywhere from 450 to 525 nanometers, right? And that's because the light absorption is the greatest there. So I'm going to have the most light absorbed by my chlorophyll that can be used for photosynthesis. So increased light absorption, increased photosynthesis rate. Where do you believe photosynthesis activity will be the lowest? Well, I'll look and I'm going to say, ooh, man, definitely starting here for this pigment, kind of ending here for here. So I would say probably anywhere between 525 to about 625 maybe. With the lowest rate definitely being in this sort of area. It's really messy, but whatever. And this is because this would be the light absorption being the least. Translating this to an experiment, right? If you had the chance to design an experiment, what sort of variables would you study? Where would you, like what color light bulbs could you use to see the effect of light wavelength on different plants and their rate of photosynthesis? But yeah, so with that, I encourage you to write down your key takeaways, the big questions that you have, and see you next time on the Screencast.